Hey there. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Clint Gibbler, and I'm the head of security research at Semgrep, a code analysis company that handles first-party, third-party code, as well as scanning for secrets. I also write the TLDRSec newsletter, so a nice way to keep up with the latest and greatest happenings in cybersecurity. But today, I'm thrilled to be joined by Chris Hughes, who's the president of Aquia and author of a very cool supply chain security book. But I will let him introduce himself.
Yeah, definitely. I'm excited to chat and be here. I've honestly followed your newsletter. It's been several years now. I've cited many of the articles and shared them with folks at my company and on LinkedIn and things like that. But Chris Hughes, I'm the co-founder and president at a company named Aquia. We're a cybersecurity consulting firm, focus a lot on the public sector and the federal space, but also commercial space a little bit. But outside of that, I also am a chief security advisor at Indoor Labs and a cyber innovation fellow at CISA, focused on software supply chain security, and have been around this space, just shy of 20 years, both active duty military time and industry side as well.
Well, very cool. And yeah, I appreciate the compliment about TLDRSec. So a lot of the cool stuff that I come across is often shared by you on LinkedIn. So thanks for sharing cool stuff. Okay, so basically how this is going to go is there was a couple core topics that we thought would be generally useful and sort of nice, both warm up and like get into some of the details. But we're planning to spend a lot of time focusing on questions from you all. So feel free. I think you should have the ability to like post a question or in the chat, and then one of my colleagues is going to be monitoring those and can feed some of us then later on. So anyway, so we're going to chat for a bit on like the core areas of supply chain security, some high ROI things, maybe some spicy takes, and then we'll focus a lot of the time on questions. So, feel free to ask whatever is most pressing and useful to you. And yeah, if you don't ask any questions, we can just, stare at the camera silently for a long time. But I'm just kidding. We won't do that. Okay, so Chris, to get us kicked off, I'm curious, in your opinion, what are the core areas of supply chain security? So let's say someone's totally new, they're wanting to figure out, like, I keep hearing about it, like, what are the core buckets? Like, what are the things I should focus on or keep in mind? Because one thing I found is people will talk about supply chain security, or a company will say they're a supply chain security company, but there could be like 10 different companies that say that, and they actually do very different things. So I'm curious, in your mind, like, how would you break up supply chain security into like core areas?
Yeah, definitely. I wanted to back up just a little bit. You mentioned a book. I wrote a book called Software Transparency. I meant to mention that. It's from
Oh,
Wiley, and
yeah,
it
yeah.
goes on software supply chain security. So to cover a lot of the things that we'll probably end up talking about. But I think it, like you said, it's kind of a term that means something different to everyone you ask. Like if you say zero trust, you'll probably get a slew of different answers of what zero trust is. So like software supply chain security, some people take a kind of a developer-centric approach of open source software, proprietary first-party code, DevOps tool chains, CI/CD platforms, et cetera, things that produce applications and software. But honestly, I think it's a bit more complex and nuanced than that. Like if you look at the modern software supply chain, it's including things like cloud service providers, SaaS providers, for example, especially with more and more software being delivered over the internet as SaaS. So essentially, it's any kind of software that you're consuming, as well as some of the tools and processes and technologies you're using to produce software, if you're producing software internally as well. So it's a pretty broad, comprehensive spectrum, and I think that's why we see people playing in different aspects of it, whether it's SCA tooling, or focus on open source, or focus on SaaS, or all those kind of things. There's a lot of different variations of what people interpret software supply chain security to be.
Yeah, definitely. That makes sense. I think when I was thinking about it, and a friend, Francis, and I wrote sort of a supply chain deep dive that I can link to as well. But I think I was focused more on like your company writing code. And I think what you just called out about both cloud providers and especially SaaS providers is interesting as well.
Yeah, I think first off, that was an awesome write-up. I shared it, and I think folks should definitely check that out. It was a really great article from you both. And I think you're spot on. Like there's the aspect of developing applications and software internally, for example. But even in the case of doing that, we've seen that, there's obviously attackers focusing on things like open source software, libraries and components and projects. But there's something to be said about SaaS. And you're likely using SaaS as part of producing that software. If you're using GitHub, for example, or you're using X number of cloud-based service providers, for example, to do the activities that you do, as well as the tools that you're using to do this, whether it's, things that you're self-hosting, for example, in a pipeline, or you're using, SaaS or cloud-based services to produce that code as well and do activities within that tool chain. So I think it's a great approach you guys took in that article, kind of covering the landscape, what people need to be familiar with, some of the key players in terms of vendors and products. So definitely an awesome article for folks to check out for sure.
Yeah, I'm probably going to butcher it a bit, but to maybe summarize some of those key things. I think the way we thought of it was, you're writing your first party code, you've got the third party libraries you're using. So some of those might be out of date and have vulnerabilities in it. So that would be like the SCA Gartner term, or whoever created that name. Another threat, as you just talked about with third party libraries, is like some of those could be malicious, either malicious from the start, or an existing legit one has been taken over via typo squatting, or someone compromises the developer account, or even like a malicious PR. There's lots of ways it can happen. But to me, I would say, even though both of those have to do with like third-party libraries, I feel like technically how you detect them is like very different. So I would treat those sort of differently. And then, yeah, as you were talking about the CI/CD tools and platforms you use, there's various hardening steps. When we were chatting before this, I think you talked about OpenSSF scorecard and like other similar tools that are both looking for indicators about like, is this an open source repo you should trust, as well as like, do the maintainers maybe have 2FA? Do they have like +1? Like no one could just push to master or to the main branch immediately, like stuff like that. So I think, yeah, when I was a security consultant at NCC Group, whenever we came across Jenkins on a project, if you were doing like a red team, it was like pretty much always game over, because there's just a lot of ways to sort of shoot yourself in the foot. Let's see.
Yeah.
I see you smiling. Is this something you've came
Well, I was
across
just
as well?
Jenkins, I've heard that from many folks, and they definitely have sort of a reputation, in terms of being vulnerable or easily exploited in some cases. And then I think one point you made is pretty prudent. Is like there's something to be said about vulnerabilities, right? Everyone's focusing on CVEs and vulnerabilities and exploitability and things like that. But those are often lagging indicators of risk, right? At that point, we know there's risk because there's a known vulnerability. But there's also leading indicators of risk, like you talked about with OpenSSF scorecard, for example, in the open source space. Like how many maintainers are participating in this? How fast do they typically remediate vulnerabilities? What is the posture of the repository, configurations, and things like that? How users interact with it from a development perspective. So there's a lot to it in terms of like vulnerabilities is a great aspect of it. And even that, we can go down a rabbit hole of known exploitation, exploitability, reachability, right? And I'm sure we'll touch on some of these things. But then there's the broader aspect of, the people actually contributing to the code and participating in the development of it. And then also in the conversation around software supply chain security, one thing I think that often is misunderstood is, open source software is typically free to use as is. There's no assurances of them remediating a vulnerability or responding to your inquiry or your security questionnaire that you send them. They're not a vendor, basically. They're not a supplier in the traditional sense, like you would work with a software company. So organizations, I think, have a bit of a false sense of security of using it without thinking about the fact that you are responsible for it. You own it now. Like you have to be responsible for it.
Yeah, totally. I think most companies I've spoken with don't have rigorous processes around that, or it kind of just, it happens how it happens. There's maybe only Google I've heard where I may be misquoting this, but I thought I was speaking with someone and they were talking about how like if you're bringing a new dependency, then basically they're like, well, cool, like you own that now. So like you are responsible for the security of this, not necessarily relying on the open source maintainer, because they may fork it and make changes internally. Okay, so
Just on that note, I think that there's even some just there. Like if you're, obviously like a well-equipped, amazing, technically competent organization like Google, you may be in a position to fork it and take responsibility for something and things like that. If you're a small, mid-sized company with limited resources and expertise, you're likely not going to, fork major, projects and start to kind of run with them yourself. So there's definitely nuances to the landscape of maturity of organizations and what they can and can't do too.
Totally. Realistically, almost no company I feel like has the resources to do that. Yeah, maybe like 3 do or something. Cool. And then maybe the last area in my mind would be, I don't know, maybe the best name, but I would say like code provenance or something. So it's like your developers are writing code, it's going through CI/CD, eventually it's deployed. How do you make sure that what you wrote at the beginning is the same as what's actually deployed? So making sure nothing is sort of inserted early on or even during CI, maybe there's a compromised GitLab runner or something like that, and then all the way to production. So I think, yeah, code provenance, I feel like is the common term for like, I wrote it here and it's the same thing that was deployed here.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's the nature of the complexity of like the development process as it is. It's understanding the pedigree and provenance of a piece of code or a software artifact, as it's typically called by CNCF and groups like that. And now we're starting to see a lot of focus around attestations. Showing attestations of the build process and what occurred and what machines were involved and what users were involved and things like that. But that's another level of complexity and maturity that most organizations simply aren't quite that far down the journey yet, to be honest.
Yeah, definitely. I think like Salsa, Sigstore, things like that seem very much aimed at tackling that problem. But to your point, I feel like you're already doing a lot of things right, probably, if you care about that.
Yeah, just a little plug for Salsa in particular. When you were talking about the provenance conversation, it makes me think they have a great image. If people go there and talk about, like, look at the image of source, build, deployment, it kind of lays out the potential threat vectors or attack vectors along the way and, kind of mitigating controls. So Salsa is a great framework for folks to go and kind of dig into that, that full software development lifecycle and potential threats across that.
Definitely. And I forget if it's OpenSSF or maybe you remember better than me, but I think there's some group who has published some example like GitHub action workflows that rather than, so building this from scratch might be a lot of work, but if you just sort of fork their template, then if you're, I guess, using GitHub actions and you fork their template, it gives you a lot of build provenance or like Salsa level guarantees, kind of like for free, as long as you conform to their structure, which I think is nice.
Yeah, I think it was them, and they also published a great kind of a threat model, like a notional threat model of kind of the modern software supply chain. It talks about some of the things we're talking about that you can apply to your own use case or take and use as a starting point. So definitely a great resource for sure.
Yeah, so moving on, so we've talked about a number of different areas. I'm curious for the people listening, for myself, like where do you feel like a company should focus first on their journey? Like what are the maybe high ROI, so like low to moderate investment, but high maybe security risk reduction type things you can do? And to sort of reiterate some of the areas that we talked about, so like looking at your like third-party dependencies, are they out of date and are there CVEs? Maybe trying to prevent malicious dependencies, maybe hardening CI/CD systems, build provenance things. You also talked about like cloud and SaaS apps, and maybe understanding, having like an inventory of things, potentially other areas as well. So out of the many things that one could do, where do you feel like, assuming you're not a super mature organization like Google or something like that, like let's say you're kind of just starting.
Yeah, I think you actually used the key word that came to mind as soon as you started asking the question for me, which was, inventory. And one thing I was really amazed by, when I started really digging deep on software supply chain security and working on the book and things like that, is like, software asset inventory has been a critical control, via CIS or SANS, for decades, right? Years or even decades. But when it comes to open source software, for example, we have a really poor understanding of our inventory. So I think a great first step is just understanding what software are we even using? What are we consuming? Where are we consuming it from? What are the kind of channels that we acquire these artifacts? What controls do we have have in place of ensuring that we're not just bringing anything from anywhere without any kind of rigor or governance around it, so that we can start to have an inventory. And then, moving beyond the open source aspect, same thing on the cloud or SaaS front, is just understanding like what SaaS providers are we integrating and working with. And we talked about this a little bit off air, is like it's one thing to say, oh yeah, we have workloads in AWS, Azure, and GCP, right? But what about the 200, 300, and some studies show several hundred SaaS providers or large enterprises using? Typically, the security team doesn't have good visibility of that. Often because people can just use a credit card, go out, spin up an account, start putting organizational data in there, maybe sensitive data. There's a lack of federation with identity providers, things like that. So just understanding the software you're using, whether it's open source software components or third-party, SaaS providers, things of that nature, and your lines of communication with the vendors in those cases around vulnerabilities, remediations, risks, things like that, and how responsive they are, and what kind of contractual language you have with them in some cases. And then also, I would say, lean into some of the existing guidance that's out there. Is I kind of joke a couple times recently, like we're best practices rich, but implementation poor. There's NIST, there's CNCF, there's SALSA, like the list goes on. Microsoft, like there's so many best practices, guidance, frameworks out there around software supply chain security, but we simply, like many organizations, haven't gotten too far down the path of actually implementing them. So just picking one and kind of going down that path and starting to mature can go a long way, in my opinion.
Yeah, I like that. And one thing that strikes me, we are like best practice or recommendation rich and implementation poor. I really love that. And before I say this, I'm a huge fan of CISA. I think they do really great work, but I feel like some of the guides I see from them or others, the things they talk about are like least privilege or like, like don't do things. And then it says something that's like obviously bad. And I'm like, yes, but could you be a bit more like tactical about how actually one might do this? And I understand they don't want to be too prescriptive because people's environments vary. And then if you start being like super descriptive, everyone like doing that quickly rabbit holes into like a massive amount of work versus explaining the principles, which I think are also important. But yeah, I get
a couple things on that. I first off, like I said, I'm a cyber innovation at CISA. I don't speak on behalf of them. I just want to throw that out there. These are all my personal opinions and views. But I think you're spot on in the sense that it's kind of like a double-edged sword. Like some people I've seen say, well, NIST security or secure software development framework, for example, is it's not prescriptive enough, right? And it's like, well, they're damned if they do and damned if they don't. If they're too prescriptive, people say, hey, that's not our environment's unique. We don't use that technology, whatever. Like there's something there that makes it unique. And if they're too opaque and high level, it's not tactical enough or it's not specific enough, right? So they try to kind of balance that. And then CISA, it's ultimately the challenge there for them as well is, like you said, two things. First, you talk about like least permissive access. It's kind of like, duh, yes, we all know that. But like, and then we hear all the industry focus around zero trust and how far we're all pushing for zero trust. Everyone's making it a priority. But for example, like Datadog just had their cloud security, state of cloud security report, and everyone has massive permission sprawl, inactive accounts, everyone has more permissions than they need, more access than they need. It's like, how it's obvious, right, that we need this permissive access, but we're not really necessarily doing it well. So I think it's reiterating the fact that it needs to be done. And then also kind of the challenge with CISA is these are simply recommendations too. They can't force any software supplier, vendor, organization to do these, other than like federal agencies. They're not a regulator. They're there to just give guidance and best practices and recommendations. And they can't necessarily force anyone to do anything.
That's true. Yeah, to get a bit tactical for a second, to go back to when you were talking about understanding your inventory of things, whether that's the, say, third-party libraries you use or SaaS apps or things like that, I wondered if we could get tactical for a second, maybe specifically with understanding, say, the third-party libraries you use or just all the things you depend on. Because I think one thing that's been interesting to me chatting with people who are at like, your Dropbox or Slack or Netflix or companies with like a very like engineering forward culture, and both on the security teams as well as obviously development teams, they build a lot of things in-house. And one recurring theme with a lot of them is this focus on what are the primitives, what are like the core foundational things we can build that then can provide significant value to lots of parts of the organization, not just security teams. So for example, I think software inventory is one of those things where it's nice for security teams because you understand your risk and attack surface. It's also useful maybe for example, like platform engineering teams, so they can know, okay, cool, like what does our environment look like? Where should we invest in to try to make our developers more effective, or things like that. So it's helping like lots of different groups. It's this not just trying to solve one problem, but provide almost like a capability or a building block that helps lots of things. So sorry, this is a long rambly intro, but I'm curious, like, let's say you're a company, you don't necessarily have a lot of resources, you want to know maybe all the third-party dependencies you're using, or maybe some of your exposure there, sort of like code level, because I feel like SaaS apps are like obviously a totally different story. But I'm curious how you would get started, or how you would think about that.
Yeah, typically, like we've talked about some of the tools like the software composition analysis and things like that, where they may, go and scan a repository or a code base, or, even there's, obviously like runtime, vendors out there that look at the runtime environment to show you what's actually being invoked at runtime. So just leveraging those kind of tools is a great way to kind of, get that inventory, or at least get, maybe it's not 100%, it's not foolproof, but it gives you some understanding of, what your footprint is from a software component perspective. And it's just a great start, right? And it's scalable. Like I like the thing you talked about there was, development teams, for example, doing things that are beneficial to security. I think there's something to be said about, security kind of letting go in some sense of the control, and empowering developers with modernized tools to do some of these things themselves. Often they know the code better than security. They know, some of the nuances of the applications better than security. So having that collaborative relationship and, being able to communicate, hey, here's what we need and here's why we need it. Can you advise us on how to best do so? Developers have some great input in that front. But I think, like you said, just having things like software composition analysis, looking at your code base, getting inventory from there, or via the pipeline as new software is built and deployed into runtime environments, as well as runtime tooling, depending on the vendor, for example, can give that inventory. And then, there's something to be said. I know you are passionate about this too, but modernize SCA tooling, for example, that shows you not just where vulnerabilities are, but what's actually exploitable or known to be exploited or reachable, for example. Leveraging things like the System No Exploited Vulnerability Catalog, or EPSS, Exploit Prediction Scoring System, or reachability analysis. Because you talked about resource constraints, and that gets worse and worse the smaller the organization gets sometimes. So you need to be able to show development teams and engineering teams, here's the most critical risk, not just showing them, fix all the highs, fix all the criticals. That doesn't help. It's like, is it reachable? Is it known to be exploited? Is it likely to be exploited? Is it used in a runtime environment? Things like that can really use resources efficiently, for example.
Definitely. I think another thing in terms of controlling maybe what comes in, this is kind of heavyweight, but I've heard that some companies will have a tool like Artifactory or something, where they have like their internal package registry, where basically instead of developers and CI pulling in packages from NPM, Ruby gems, Maven, like things like that, you're instead pulling in from like, hey, we sort of host all those things internally, so then you can see when someone is pulling like a net new dependency. It's like, cool, you're creating a new repo, you're using dependencies we've already used in like 100 other repos. Cool, like I don't care, I don't need to care about that. But if it's, say, like, hey, you're pulling in this new package that we've never seen before across all of the repos within our company, then maybe that merits a conversation, especially if it has some of the metadata that you were talking about before, in terms of like, yeah, the last commit was like 2 years ago, there's only one committer, they've got like 100 issues open, and like all of them are like tag security. like maybe this is not one that we want to have internally.
Yeah, I think, a couple of things to unpack there is like, we talked about those leading indicators of risk. Some things I found that were really interesting when researching like really deep on the topic is like the term bus factor. It's like, it's kind of used to like say, if this developer gets hit by a bus, or the maintainer or contributor, like how sustainable is a project? And what was really wild is like some of the stats, and it changes depending on the study you look at and stuff, but like, I think it was 25% of open source software projects have one, maintainer, and like 90% have less than 10. And I think it was actually, who was it? It might have been Sonatype, the recent report on open source software. They found like, I think it was like 94% of all open source software is like unmaintained. And so it's like, it's pretty bizarre. It's because it's such an ecosystem that there's just a lot out there, right? And then another thing you talked about is like having that internal repository of known trusted components, for example. That's a recommendation made by NIST in their open source software guidance. It's cited in other references as well. I think in a Microsoft reference, I forget the exact acronym, but like SC2F or something like that. There's so many different frameworks like I talked about. But there's challenges to that. Like anyone who's simply, like if you've ever been responsible for maintaining golden images, right, in a large enterprise environment, I'm actually trying to maintain a known good repository of open source software components, which is infinitely more complex and expansive. Trying to do that at scale is really challenging. But that, it is a recommendation. If you have the resources, you have the expertise, you can do that for known trusted components, knowing that they have, no vulnerabilities, or at least vulnerabilities that you aren't concerned with or below your risk tolerance. You have an understanding of the project's hygiene and things that we talked about with number of contributors, 2FA, OpenSSF scorecard, things like that. But it can be difficult to do that at scale. But some organizations definitely have the resources to do that, especially for like the most pervasive, widely used components. That can definitely be a valid option for sure.
Definitely. Yeah, I've heard it's very difficult maintaining those gold images, but yeah, highly impactful though if you can do it well. I think ChainGuard might be having their, I forget what it's called, Wolfie or something, but I think they put a huge amount of effort into creating, I think, minimal images that have just the things you need, and ideally up-to-date packages that don't have known vulnerabilities, which is kind of makes sense that you would have like a single entity doing that for more people, because yeah, it's a huge amount of burden for like one team to work on.
You see, like, ChainGuard is a great example of like an innovative software supply chain company that I've been watching for a while. Like Dan and those folks are brilliant, and they're doing some great things. And like they had some early studies from John Speed-Myers, who I've interviewed on my podcast, and they talk about the importance of secure minimized base images. And they have a great study called like All About the Base, which is kind of a cool pun. But anyways, go check it out. And it talks about the importance of like secure base images. And they took that and ran with it, because organizations were trying to maintain these hardened base images, and it can be hard to do that if you offer it as a service, which they have done now, right? They kind of commoditized and commercialized it, as well as having like a free open source option as well. It's a massive burden relief from your team, right? So you can go take these known hardened base images that have little to no vulnerabilities and build on those. And you're kind of like, it's like building on a solid foundation rather than like kind of a foundation of sand that's just incredibly vulnerable and likely to be exploited.
Yeah, totally agreed. So we have a question from Adam about this topic that I think is interesting. So he said, going off of your points, we're all tired of the back and forth for open source vulnerabilities on the whole, are we actually vulnerable, and the triage time and the resources it can take to definitively answer. How confident are we that reachability analysis can actually address some of the issues here? Curious for our take on the effectiveness of the current industry offerings and key improvement areas you'd like to see as offerings mature. So even without naming specific vendors, or you can if you want to, I'm curious, like I have some thoughts on how much this actually helps. And I've seen some data on it, but yeah, I'm curious if you have thoughts, Chris, on reachability. Yeah. Does it actually solve the problem? How much does it help? Things like that.
Obviously, I don't think it solves the problem. Like this is a complicated issue, and even with reachability, there's still additional context that needs to be, what kind of data is involved. Is the system publicly reachable? Who has access to it? How critical is the system to the business and the organization and operations? There's a lot of additional context there. But I think reachability, just like I talked about with exploitability, like EPSS, reachability is just another kind of enriching contextual resource to have. Is it reachable? That's critical versus just showing this massive list of vulnerabilities of all these components that may not even be invoked at runtime or may not be reachable. So I think it's just another kind of tool in the toolbox, for example. And I think we're seeing modern, companies, and I won't name vendors just to stay agnostic, but more innovative, new SCA type vendors who are doing this kind of reachability analysis and trying to provide that context in addition to known exploitation, probability of being exploited, things like that. But I'm curious your perspective as well.
Yeah, I agree with what you've said. I think to me, reachability is not the be all end all, as I think you can potentially go further, and I'll delve into that in a second, but I do think it's very useful. So if you think about the difference between, are you including a package that is at a version that has a known CVE versus you have a package that is at a version that has a known CVE, and the function that is vulnerable for that CVE is actually being called. Obviously, as you said, you can do this statically or dynamically, like at runtime. But even if you just think statically, like think of jQuery or some library that has like hundreds or thousands of exposed methods that a person using it can use. Like, even if there's a lot of CVs, and for the example like jQuery, like what is the likelihood that you're using that one function out of the 1,000 that happens to be vulnerable? Or maybe there's more than one like for that specific CV, but I think like oftentimes you're not. And I think that people who are like sending like findings or warnings when you just happen to be using a library and you're not calling the dangerous function, so there's like no possible way it could be exploited, that seems like a big waste of time. Like you should update, like updating is good, but that is certainly not a high priority thing.
Yeah. I just want to jump in real quick there. Like, first off, it's critical from a resource constraint perspective. Like you talked about the effectiveness of it and just making efficient use of resources. But also, like, there's something to be said about the cultural impact that kind of behavior has of throwing those massive lists over the wall to, developing engineering teams from security. We've often seen security as the office of no, and we've heard a lot about DevSecOps and breaking down the silos and all that kind of activity, right? If you get in that which we've done historically, is like throwing that massive list with no context of exploitability, reachability, et cetera. You're actually bolstering those silos and not really building trust with your peers. And they're likely to stop engaging you or really dread engaging you. So there's a cultural aspect to it as well as a technical aspect, in my opinion.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's important to keep good relationships and high trust between security and engineering teams, because ultimately, mostly security teams are not the ones fixing things themselves. Like in some cases they are, but oftentimes you need developers, or there's many more of them than you. So it's nice when you can convince them to fix things. Yeah, I think if we take a step back, I think like kind of the meta observation is, well, hypothetically, let's say you were always on the latest version of every package. Not to say you should do this, because there are potential dangers of like maybe the latest version of something has been backdoored and like it hasn't been discovered yet. Maybe it's not as stable. So like there's reasons why that's not perfect. But like hypothetically, if you were always on the latest version, then this whole like outdated dependency thing, that problem would kind of go away, because you'd be like, cool, we're not on that version anymore. And obviously there's some known security issues that don't have a patch yet. So again, it's like not perfect, but I think organizations that focus on like agility or rigorous test cases, both like unit tests as well as like integration tests, like if your organization has the capability to more easily patch things and vet that it's not going to break everything, I think that is kind of one of those like foundational layer capabilities that's going to make everything better. Because if you're not used to updating things, or if you're on, I don't know, Rails 3 and the current version of Rails is like 8, like that's going to be a lot of work to update. Like you're going to have to spend, I don't know, a quarter or two, maybe more updating. Whereas if you're just doing like a minor bump, like that's a lot easier. So I think having the like engineering culture and building that muscle of updating regularly and often, and having the infrastructure and testing in place so that you can do that quickly and have high confidence you're not going to break things, I think is good for engineering velocity, but also like good for security. So you're not like, yeah, you don't give them something and they're like, it's going to take me like 10 years to fix this.
Yeah, I was going to jump in there because like something you said there is so prudent and critical to point out is like, in security, we often want things to stay the same and stay stable, right? But this is something that folks like, Kelly Shortridge, for example, as well as like State of DevOps report have been emphasizing, which is what you talked about, building that muscle of doing this incremental change iteratively, consistently, on a persistent basis. It actually leads to not only like more efficient and optimized applications, but actually more secure because you're used to doing these changes on an ongoing basis versus this big breaking massive change that just built up over a long period of time. But security is so uncomfortable with change, I think, in many cases, that we want things to stay the same. We don't want to change anything. We feel comfortable like that, but it's actually counterintuitive. It kind of, you atrophy that muscle of being resilient and being able to make change and respond to change.
Yeah, definitely. Along those lines, I was chatting with Jamie Finnegan recently. He's, I think, the head of product security at HashiCorp. And one point he made that I thought was really fascinating was like how much you need to care about, let's say a development team ships something, there's kind of some security issue. Maybe it's like not critical, but you're like, yeah, we kind of want to fix this. Like how much you care about that is partially a function of how quickly is that fixable. So like, let's say the engineering team is really good. They take feedback really well. They fix things quickly. You're like, yeah, maybe it's okay for them to ship this because I know they're going to fix it in a day or two. So the exposure is not huge versus something that this team always has a packed roadmap. When I put something on their plate, they're like, cool, we'll do that in like 3 quarters. I think that like that aspect, to your point, is also useful.
Yeah, and being receptive, to that, like you talked about, they're receptive to recommendations or requests. It comes back to, being actually a value, trusted partner and collaborator with them versus just kind of being that policeman who's coming around beating them with this massive list of vulnerabilities with no context. Is like you build that trust, you build that rapport, then they're receptive to your requests, and you also have to have empathy on your side. You may be hyper focused on security, but they have other demands on speed to market, development velocity, backlog burn down, things like that. They have other demands and incentives that are not aligned necessarily with yours. And not, so it's critical to understand, kind of what their incentives are, why they behave the way they are, and build that trust and rapport and empathy so that you can be more effective as a security practitioner, in my opinion.
Totally. I think that's key. And ultimately, they're the ones probably building features and shipping product that makes the company money, which pays your salary. So it's good that they do that. So we've got a couple of good questions. So let's see. One of them that I thought was just going to the part 2, because I feel like that's maybe a shorter answer. So I'm curious, Chris, your opinion on package repos such as NPM or PyPy. The person finds it mind-boggling that those package managers themselves haven't introduced code provenance even at the most basic level. So I guess maybe the broader question is like, what responsibility do package managers have over the security of their ecosystem, both from a malicious dependency point of view, which the person didn't ask about, but I think falls within this, as well as a code provenance point of view?
Yeah, this opens, kind of the door to, like, we're hearing like the secure by design, secure by default kind of drum being beaten by CISA and others in the industry. And, there is something to be said about what a vendor can do, a major platform provider, like we saw the introduction of 2FA, for example, right? To, developers on certain platforms. That can have a systemically wide, massive impact of improving security far beyond the scale of any single, software development organization or consumer, et cetera. So I think that these platform providers, just like cloud providers, can have a massive impact across the whole ecosystem by baking in some of these core fundamental security capabilities and features. But that said, the developer community, and especially the open source software community, they want freedom and autonomy, and sometimes they don't want to use 2FA. They don't want you to know who they even are in some cases, right? They value their anonymity. So it's just, there's something to be said about balancing that with the open source software ecosystem. But I personally think these suppliers, these vendors, I should say, these platform providers, they can have a massive impact across the ecosystem of, kind of mitigating risk, implementing fundamental security controls and capabilities that none of us can do at a scale that they can do, just because they're positioned in the ecosystem, just like a cloud service provider, for example, a GitHub or an AWS and Azure, et cetera. They can have a massive impact. And I'd like to see more involvement from them of rolling out these features and capabilities. I think it would benefit all of us, like kind of the rising tide lifts all ship kind of mantra.
Yeah, totally agree that they can have a big impact. I think if I remember correctly, I believe NPM and PyPy recently have implemented, like, I don't know if it's like mandatory 2FA, but I think if your repo is like above a certain level of popularity, I believe it might be mandatory, or at least they send you many like nagging emails about it. And I agree with the question, like it would be nice for the package manager to or really even like the language itself, like have some templates that are like, cool, if you just fork this repo, there's a bunch of tools that are like, create a new NPM package, like a folder layout structure thing for me. Like I feel like having that also has some sort of like, I don't know, if you could just like run command and it's like, cool, just develop in this structure and you'll be like salsa level 3. Like that'd be pretty cool. But I agree with you. I think you pointed out some nice nuance about how there's like trade-offs here. So from a security point of view, there's all these things we want. But I think from the individual developer point of view, a lot of them are probably like, hey, man, I'm doing this for free in my full time. And you're like giving me a lot more work to do. And like, I'm only doing this because I wanted to scratch my own itch. And then now, I don't know, some massive company is like, this is in our supply chain, like, please fix. And it's like, I did this for free on nights and weekends. You don't control me. You're not paying me. So like I totally get that angle as well. I guess another point oh yeah.
I was going to chime in, like, there's a bit of slippery slope in the sense that we ask for these fundamental features and capabilities. Obviously, these take time in their own development backlog to prioritize these features and functionality and capability. And, it's kind of like, when is the point that enough is enough in terms of what should be free and what should just be expected versus, what are they necessarily going to be compensated for from a platform provider perspective? And then, you were spot on with the free open source software ecosystem thing. Is like, they're just doing this in many cases out of their own goodwill or interest or passion for something. They're not being compensated. So it's kind of a tragedy of the digital commons, basically.
Yeah, there's a couple of startups or companies that are working on this, but I personally am a big believer in, hey, if you're using some open source library that is like critical to your business or saves you a huge amount of time, like if you would have had to pay one of your developers to build this thing, but you don't, like developers are expensive. So they're saving you a ton of time and money. So even if you're only paying them a fraction of that amount of money, that seems very fair to me. So I don't know, separate conversation, but I feel like having more sustainable business models for people contributing to the common good, I would like to see personally.
Yeah, real quick comment on that. Like, I've come across, companies, I won't like name names again, but there's companies playing in that space of kind of brokering that compensation model for people who use projects and how critical they are for your organization. Then there's been commitments from the major, the Googles and Microsoft to the open source software ecosystem as well, which is great to see. But obviously it will get more challenging at scale. There's so many open source software project libraries, components, et cetera, contributors that, like, okay, how critical is this now? How much dollars, should we attribute to this? Like, it can be difficult to do that across every open source software component that you're using. But I think we obviously need to see more resources go into this ecosystem. Everyone's kind of taking advantage of it and using it without really contributing back to it financially in a lot of cases.
Totally. One last comment I have about package managers, say like PyPy, NPM, Ruby Gems, others. I don't know about most of them, but my understanding, and this could be totally wrong, please feel free to correct me, is that most of these are some sort of like foundation, or like they're not, so GitHub acquired NPM, so that's like an exception. But I feel like for most of them, this is like volunteers, people passionate about the language. I feel like most of them don't have full-time salaried people working on them. So like partly it's frustrating in terms of like, yeah, it would be nice to be able to install packages from PyPy, NPM, others, and not worry that it's going to be malware. Like that would be nice. But if it's mostly people doing it because they're passionate about it or in their free time and it's not their full-time job, that's kind of a big expectation, because there's maybe hundreds of thousands of criminals who are like, yeah, I'm going to write something bad and host it there. So I feel like given the like how maybe under-resourced those teams are, that seems like I would like it to happen personally, but it seems maybe not fair to expect that of them.
Yeah.
So yeah,
a little plug for open source software security podcast. If anyone follows Josh Brushers and those folks, they have some great content on this kind of topic. But you're spot on. It's like everyone thinks that this would be nice and that would be nice, but like no one actually wants to pay for what would be nice. They just want it.
Yeah, I think this interesting place we've sort of got into is a couple of companies playing in the supply chain security space are now just like continuously scanning all of the package registries and then writing nice blog posts about the things they find and reporting to getting them taken down like as they find them. So I don't know, it's kind of like, I guess, security marketing budget is what's funding the security of these platforms, because the companies are like, well, maybe we're building a product in the space, but also we want cool marketing content, so we're going to like find the malware and get it taken down, versus like the registry doing it themselves. I don't know if that totally makes sense, but it seems like what's happening to me.
No, you're spot on. I think there's a bit of, obviously there's a marketing in the sense that we found, hey, we found 11,000 malicious packages on this package manager, and like we reported it to the, the provider, platform provider, et cetera. There's a bit of a marketing spin to that. And it also feels like a bit like whack-a-mole. Like you just kind of keep chasing it, right? And kind of chasing these things and reporting them, and it's going to keep occurring. But, we need to obviously get out there and find these malicious things and report them and bring visibility to them. And then also, like, one thing you said that made me think about the platform provider aspect is, this opens the door. Like if you look at the national cyber strategy, not to go to the federal space on us, but they talk about the responsibility of cloud service providers, for example, of like not allowing malicious activity on their platform. Like people spin up, virtualized infrastructure, start attacking critical infrastructure from AWS or Azure, right? Within those environments, does the platform provider have a responsibility? If so, how much? How far should they go? Same thing for these package, platforms and providers too.
Yeah, that's a great point. because on the one side, it would be like, yeah, AWS, you have a lot of resources. You should like maybe do something about this. But also, yeah, it's so expansive and massive. Like, how would you do that at scale? How would you make that be low noise? Yeah, yeah, I think we've highlighted a number of things that were like, it's kind of nuanced. It's difficult.
As it turns out,
One thing that
it's complicated.
sorry. Yeah, totally. One thing that I'd be very curious about your opinion on. So another question, and I think this plays up nicely to your experience. So supply chain seems like it's being accelerated by compliance, such as adherence to SDLC policies, executive orders, things like that. Do you foresee supply chain falling under GRC once mature tools are available, as opposed to maybe like an AppSec or a ProdSec team, perhaps?
This is one we could talk about for like an hour. First off, I say I hope it doesn't go that route because it could become a compliance checkbox exercise, which to some extent it will become that. Vendors, suppliers, software suppliers are only going to do what they're required to do in many cases because, as much as we hate to say it, security has a cost to it. It requires resources, time, investment, and energy. So people are only going to do what they're required to do in a lot of cases. But there are, there's no denying that like a lot of this supply chain security focus has been driven by the cybersecurity executive order. And then, there's been Office of Management and Budget, not to get into like acronym soup on folks, but basically the federal government is trying to use their massive purchasing power to drive, systemic change across the software ecosystem and baking these things into federal contract requirements. For example, you have to start to attesting to using NIST secure software development framework. You have to maybe potentially provide artifacts like an SBOM, those kind of things. You have to provide attestations in some cases. So it is definitely being driven by, things like executive orders and the federal push to kind of drive systemic change. But then again, like same thing with the platform providers, the government is uniquely positioned in some cases due to their purchasing power to drive some of these systemic changes. No single company can do what the federal government can do in some cases. But I also hope that it doesn't go the route of just falling under GRC and being a checkbox, because we've seen, how many examples of a company that has a SOC 2, has a FedRAMP, has a whatever, right? And they still get breached, right? Because we all know compliance and security, while they're crucial to one another, they're not exactly the same. So I hope it doesn't go that route. And I also think there's something to be said about GRC needing to kind of evolve. GRC is a lot of still paper-based, static, manual activities. It needs to evolve to, the age of DevOps, codified artifacts, machine-readable artifacts, automation, the same way the infrastructure as code has kind of come along to the way of working in codified formats. Long answer, but I think there's definitely, like I said, something to be said about the federal entities and what they're trying to do across the ecosystem, but I really hope it doesn't just become a compliance exercise. But then again, suppliers will only do what they're required to do because they don't want to necessarily spend, they have limited resources and they're focused on revenue or market, things like that.
Yeah, I think you made a ton of great points. Yeah, I had a bunch of things I wanted to talk about, inspired by what you said. I think one of the things, totally agree. I think I see some like initial promising evidence of GRC functions becoming more like DevOpsy in terms of, hey, here's the security controls we need to measure. Like it's taking us forever to like manually, like we go talk to the people, we look at the settings, we have an Excel, we update. I think there's been a couple of conference talks about like continuous compliance, or I think there's some tools that are like Ansible or Terraform-ish that are like compliance as code, where you're like, cool, here's some security controls or security properties we want always to be true. Can we codify that in code so that getting like the audits are not this manual thing, but they're more like, here's the automations we build that guarantee that these things always must be true. And as long as you can sort of prove that those automations are correct, you're like continuously compliant. So I think there's like a lot of work that's being done, and I think that sort of stuff is exciting. Yeah, I think my positions on compliance have sort of changed over time. I think earlier on, I was like, it's kind of a waste of time. It's like checkboxy. It's like useless. But on the other hand, I think like just because something doesn't totally prevent you from being hacked, well, like nothing ultimately does that. It's like very difficult. There's always a way in. But I think like hygiene things are useful, right? Like, I guess maybe it's not like, hey, you're SOC 2 and that means you're impervious. It might instead mean, hey, you're not doing anything negligent. It's like you're not perfect, but you're not like just totally not doing anything that you should be doing. And I think that like I think that's a better frame, in my opinion, for like compliance and GRC type things. It's not like, hey, your security is perfect. It's more like, hey, here's a baseline that we can all agree that if you don't do this, you're kind of being negligent. And so let's at least do the fundamentals, because ultimately, I think in security, a huge amount of the risk reduction is just doing the fundamentals. It's not doing something crazy.
Yeah, I think, man, a lot of solid points there. First off, like the fundamentals is absolutely crucial, because as all the focus on AI and 0 days, it's often the little things that are getting organizations, the lack of the fundamentals, like least permissive access control, and just the things that we talked about in the earlier part of the conversation. And then also, like, I don't like the demonization of compliance either, because one, we've seen that the industry will, in many cases, simply won't do something if they're not required to. So compliance forces, it's a forcing function to get organizations to at least do some level of security rigor for some in some cases. And it also gives us like a common lexicon, a common conversation we can have, at least of, we know these things are being done or should be being done. Because otherwise it's kind of this opaque, security is this opaque, undefinable thing, because there's so many different environments, tools, technologies, configurations, et cetera. And then also, like, the last part I want to make a point about is, early on in my time of dealing with cloud, it's been like almost 10 years now, but security was so afraid of cloud and didn't like, they felt uncomfortable with cloud. But ironically, cloud and APIs and things like that have allowed us to be more secure. Like you said, now we have configuration as code, compliance as code. We can actually start to analyze all the systems and configurations and settings and software in a much more efficient manner than the legacy days of sampling and paper-based, documentation and screenshots and shoulder surfing and all that kind of stuff. And we're seeing a lot of innovations and investments in that space to bring GRC to the forefront of where we are in software today, of using APIs to analyze environments on an ongoing basis, not every quarter, not every year, but in a near real-time assessment type capacity. So I think GRC is coming quite a ways, and it's got a lot of ways to go still, but we're seeing a lot of innovations that are really promising, in my opinion, too.
Agreed. Yeah, my friend, along those lines, I think my friend Daniel Miessler wrote a blog post recently about how security is going to transition from this like arcane artisanal wizardry to more like accounting. And I think the argument he was making is that when you're still figuring something out and there's a lot of unknowns, then there's a lot of like one-off like expertise, like creative things that are happening. But I think, and this is something that I've seen in a number of companies, but like a sign of maturity in any area is that basically like best practices are very clear, and like following them, like how to do it is very obvious, and the like risks are very known, and it's like obvious how to avoid them. I think, to take like an analogy or metaphor, like look at like planes and like plane safety. It's like very like checklisty, or like it's not like, oh, how safe your plane is based on how good your pilot is. Like that's like not a great place to be in. I think there's very rigorous like standards, and like this is how we do things. And I think similarly in security, I don't know, like my big vision for security is, I think security should largely be transparent to developers. It should happen like all around them. They should not have to care about it, and just like using the building blocks or primitives or things that you give them, then they don't have to care about security. So it's like, cool, you want to parse XML, use this library, and it makes XXE impossible. You want to output to the view, use this library, it makes XSS impossible. And like, just like enable them to focus on what they're good at, which is building, like shipping features quickly and building performance systems, and not having to care about like this esoteric like security stuff. So I think if we were to do that, I think that would make a huge impact on security in general, but it would also in some ways make security more boring and more just like, not as much, hey, I was able to find this crazy exploit, but more like, are you using the right library? Yes. Are you using the right framework? Yes. And it's just like boom, boom, boom. So I think Daniel's post and kind of how I feel like things are going, I feel like they're similar. At least that's directionally, I feel like it would be a good way to head.
Yeah, definitely. I agree. Real quick, I read that article too. He kind of compared it to a cyber CFO, and he talked about the evolution of cybersecurity and how it's matured. And I think you're absolutely spot on. Like in kind of making it opaque or abstract, from the developers, let them focus on their core competencies, what they're incentivized to do, what their job is, and empower them with developer-centric tooling that can let them do the right thing, like without having to overthink it and overcomplicate it. And we are seeing some innovative, providers produce tooling, as well as security adopting like configuration as code and hardened infrastructure as code templates and things like that. So we're making progress, but we have a long way to go still.
Yeah, agreed. Okay, so number of questions, a couple about sharing different resources. So yes, we will definitely share those after. We can maybe include those even in the comments on the video when it's posted to YouTube, or maybe just send you an email. We'll try to include it in an email to you. So look out for that. Let's see. Yeah, I don't have an answer for this, but I'm curious, Chris, if you do, about have you seen any successful solutions for helping developers easily keep dependencies up to date with regular minor updates, helping avoid the disruptive, like drop everything for a major package upgrade that needs to happen now?
Yeah, I mean, I know there's some stuff out there that folks will use like Dependabot and Renovate and things like that to kind of keep dependencies up to date with the latest versions and things like that. But as you point out, like there's some nuance to that of like breaking changes and things of that nature. But there's definitely some tools out there for folks to check out. I did see one other question. It says, minimizing developer work by reachability analysis and relying on EPSS versus fixing all CVEs. Like, yes, that's a no-brainer. Like, for example, there was 20,000 CVEs last year, less than 5% were ever actually exploited. We have to use reachability and exploitability to drive that context. So yeah, definitely some good questions coming in, and thanks for the chat and folks dropping questions. I always appreciate it too.
Yeah, thanks for all the questions. This is super helpful, and I love seeing what people care about and what's useful. Yeah, to go into, so that was Florian about minimizing developer work using reachability analysis. So I will say we did some initial studies, and we found that if you were to say, given a couple of example repos, how many have dependencies that have open CVEs? Like, what is that number? And then of those, how many are actually calling the vulnerable function? And at least in like a random data set we found just like looking at popular repos on GitHub, I think it was something like 95 to 98% of the CVEs that were there were not reachable, or at least they were not calling the vulnerable function. So yeah, so like 90+% is a huge reduction in the amount of things you need to do. And maybe you should still update, but at least in terms of like drop everything and fix it, that's like a huge reduction. But yeah, so I'm curious if you've seen any data on that, Chris, or just have any general reachability thoughts.
No, I mean, I've seen similar figures in terms of the value of coupling like reachability and EPSS, and that EPSS has some great images out there that just show, here's like, if you were to take the approach of fix all high criticals versus, using EPSS, for example, organizations like Scientia and Wade Baker and his team over there, they've shown that using the traditional fix all severity critical type stuff is just as effective as randomly picking CVEs. It's like not effective at all versus like focusing on exploitability. So I think coupling reachability, like you talked about, as well as exploitability, is absolutely critical. And then you talked about 90+%. I've seen similar figures, from organizations and studies, and you think about like just how much noise that reduces, how much signal that produces, so you can efficiently apply your resources of driving down organizational risk. We're all in the business of trying to drive down organizational risk and facilitate secure business outcomes. So to do that, we need context and we need capabilities like reachability and EPSS for sure.
Yeah, I have a potentially like spicy follow-up question. So I have opinions on this, but I'm curious your thoughts. What do you feel, or how do you feel about transitive reachability? So let's say you're writing your code depends directly on foo, and then foo relies on bar, and then bar has a open CVE. Let's say it's like a high severity. Like, how much do you care about that?
I think, so not to make a little plug here, but like I talked about, I'm involved in one organization called Ender Labs, and they had the state of dependency analysis, I think it was, and they had a report showing that 6 out of 7 vulnerabilities actually come from the transitive dependencies. So it's critical to understand like the full dependency tree to the extent possible, right? And then kind of understand reachability within those, transitive dependencies, because there could be a lot of vulnerabilities that are kind of lurking below the surface if you're only looking at your first party dependencies. But as we talked about, organizations have finite resources, time, and tooling in some cases. So without the visibility of the full dependency tree, or at least to the extent that you can get it, you're going to be really limited to tackle some of those transitive dependency risks.
Yeah, I think knowing what's there, I totally agree, is useful. I guess my spicy take on this is, and to be clear, I have no data to back this up, so I'm a little hesitant to say it, but I think, I guess I'm a little skeptical that transitive vulnerabilities matter. And let me make an intuitive argument that's based on no data. So I'm going to emphasize the no data part. So like, what is the likelihood that your code calls a function in like foo, and that function then calls like that like vulnerable like function in bar, and user input comes into your application, is then passed to foo, and then foo passes it to bar. So like, I don't know, the likelihood that that happens in practice and is exploitable like on a path that an attacker can actually call, to be honest, I'm kind of skeptical. Like, I feel like I've never heard of a breach where that happened. Like, it's usually like yeah, there are a couple of blockbuster vulnerabilities per year. Let's say like your log4shell, things like that. Yeah, like yeah, there's like one or two of them a year, but like you probably read about them in the news. So I don't know. For anything that's not in the news, personally, I'm a little skeptical that that's ever exploitable in practice. I could be
Yeah,
totally wrong, but that's
I
my
think
intuitive belief.
I think it's a practical take. And like, honestly, like, it goes beyond just the technical aspect, like citing Scientia again. They had a study recently showing like, I think it was like 94% of organizations, fourth and beyond party providers, not just software suppliers, but, party, suppliers in general around cybersecurity supply chain, had a breach right in the last year. It's like, it doesn't mean that it necessarily impacts you. It doesn't mean you shouldn't be concerned with it, but we all have limited time, resources, and attention, to tackle some of these things. So I think like you talked about the primitives, is like focusing on the core things, the most pressing risks that are most immediate and visible to you, and then kind of going beyond that, maturing and looking at transitive dependencies, looking at fourth, fifth party suppliers, et cetera. So we all have limited time and resources. So I think it's a spicy take, but it's a practical take in my opinion.
Yeah, because again, ultimately, you have limited time and resources, as you've highlighted, and yeah, every team has more work than they could do given the time they have. So ultimately, yeah, if you can only fix a couple of things, just maybe you can only get developers to prioritize a couple of things. Yeah, you have to choose. So the things that are most likely to bite you are the things that are nice to do. Okay, so we're at time, or a little bit over time. I'm curious, Chris, do you have any final maybe words of wisdom or advice, or like something you would like to leave people with?
Yeah, definitely. First off, just folks, anyone that tuned in or listened to the conversation, definitely thank you for tuning in, and I really appreciate
Yeah, thank you.
well as the questions from the audience. I'm happy to chat with anyone on LinkedIn. You can find me on there. If you haven't subscribed already to TLDRSec, definitely do so. And then, just parting words is, like I said, just get started. Look for, don't kind of try to boil the ocean, but look at, a framework, a resource that we've talked about throughout this conversation, whether it's SSDF or, resources from CISA, et cetera, SALSA, things like that, and just kind of get started going down the path, because, you're not going to boil the ocean, but you can make a lot of impact, like we talked about, by focusing on the most pressing things and just getting started.
Totally. And I would also encourage people to check out either connect or follow you on LinkedIn, because you're always sharing great things. And that's how I keep up with a lot of supply chain things. So yeah, keep sharing great stuff. I appreciate it.
Will do.
Well, cool. Yeah, everyone, thank you so much for your time. We will send out a number of resources that people ask questions about. And thank you so much for the questions. And yeah, have a wonderful rest of your day. Yeah, take care, everybody.